The silence she carried was a deliberate thing, a structure she had built inside herself, brick by heavy brick. It was not an absence of noise, but a fortress against it. Tonight, the noise was a symphony of forced laughter and the clinking of crystal flutes, a sound that scraped against the raw edges of her composure. Ilara stood near a marble column, the cool stone a welcome anchor in the swirling sea of the obsidian gala. Her gown, a deep, liquid emerald, felt like armor she had donned for a battle, only she knew she was fighting. It was architecturally precise, much like the buildings she designed in her mind, but for which her husband Marcus always took the credit. She had made the decision 3 days ago, in the sterile quiet of the guest bedroom she had occupied for the last 6 months. The decision had not arrived like a thunderclap, but had settled like fine dust over every surface of her life, a slow, inevitable accumulation of neglect and quiet cruelties. She would leave. The word itself was small, but it held the weight of a collapsing star. She had spent the intervening hours planning her escape with the same meticulous detail she applied to a blueprint, arranging logistics, securing a small fund he did not know about, and steeling her heart for the fallout. Tonight was the last performance. The dutiful wife, an elegant accessory on the arm of Marcus Vance, senior vice president of Sterling Coal. He thrived in these environments, his power a tangible aura he wore like an expensive cologne. He moved through the crowd with a practiced ease, his hand a possessive brand on the small of her back. She endured it. Endurance was a muscle she had been forced to exercise until it was the strongest part of her. She watched him now, holding court near the cascading ice sculpture of a swan. His posture was a study in performed relaxation, a casual swagger that broadcasted his importance. He laughed, a booming sound meant to draw attention, and gestured with a half-full glass of champagne. He was magnetic, she had to give him that. He drew people in, made them feel seen, but it was all a transaction. He was a master of leveraging perception. Her perception of him had long since curdled from admiration to a cold, clear-eyed assessment. He was hollow, a beautifully constructed facade with nothing of substance behind it. She had slipped away when a senator cornered him, the pressure of his hand on her back finally gone. She needed a moment for the silence inside her to reassert itself, to push back the encroaching noise. The terrace was just beyond a set of glass doors, overlooking the city's glittering sprawl. A cool night breeze whispered a promise of freedom. She closed her eyes just for a second and imagined walking out of this ballroom, out of this life, and never looking back. The fantasy was so vivid she could almost feel the worn strap of her travel bag on her shoulder. The image was shattered by a hand clamping down on her upper arm. It was not a gentle touch. It was a grip of ownership. "There you are." Marcus's voice was a low growl, stripped of its public charm. "What are you doing out here? Hiding? Senator Albright was asking for you. You are being rude." Ilara did not flinch. She opened her eyes and looked at his hand, at the way his fingers dug into the delicate silk of her sleeve, bruising the flesh beneath. "I needed some air," she said, her voice even, devoid of the tremor she felt deep in her bones. "You need to be inside, smiling," he corrected, his grip tightening. "This is an important night. The Thorn merger is on the line. I need you to be the supportive wife, not some skulking wallflower. Is that understood?" She thought about the Thorn merger. She had been the one who worked for 3 sleepless weeks on the integration proposal, the architectural synergy analysis that had made Sterling Coal's bid so compelling. Her name was nowhere on the final document, only his. "Let go of my arm, Marcus." His eyes, which so many people described as charismatic, narrowed into chips of cold fury. He had not updated the file on her. He was working from a version of her that had been obsolete for months, a version that would have flinched and apologized. "What did you say to me?" "I said," she repeated, her gaze lifting from his hand to his face, "let go." For a moment he looked genuinely surprised. It was a flicker of confusion in the face of an unexpected variable. Then the surprise was consumed by rage. It was the rage of a man whose authority had been questioned, whose property was suddenly showing a will of its own. "You have an obligation, Alara," he hissed, pulling her closer until she could smell the champagne on his breath. "An obligation to me, to this marriage. You don't get to make demands." She did not scream. She did not struggle. She simply stood there, her silence no longer a fortress but a weapon. A quiet, unyielding declaration of refusal. This was the moment. The breaking point she had been anticipating with a mixture of terror and grim relief. From the shadows at the far end of the terrace, a man watched. He had been there for some time, a silhouette against the city lights, holding a glass of what looked like water. He was not hiding. He was simply still, the kind of stillness that commands a space more effectively than any grand gesture. Julian Thorne, the CEO of Thorne Industries and the host of this very gala, had been observing the Vances for several minutes. He had noted the woman's elegant exhaustion, the man's performative power. He saw the interaction not as a domestic dispute, but as a hostile takeover attempt, and his sympathies did not lie with the aggressor. He had recognized Alara Vance from the dossier his team had prepared on Sterling Cole. But it was not her photo as Marcus Vance's wife that had caught his attention. It was a footnote in the deep dive analysis, a stray comment from a disgruntled former junior architect at their firm. All the best ideas, the foundational concepts for the Meridian Tower, the Azure Building, they came from her. He just presented them. Julian Thorne did not deal in rumors, but he filed away inconsistencies. The woman standing before him, radiating a strength that was as quiet and profound as bedrock, did not seem like a mere accessory. As Marcus's voice grew lower and more venomous, Julian set his glass down on the marble balustrade. The sound was a small, sharp clink in the relative quiet of the terrace, yet it cut through the tension like a razor. Marcus flinched, turning toward the sound. His entire posture shifted, the predator caught in an unexpected light. He saw the figure detaching from the shadows, and his face cycled through a rapid series of expressions. Annoyance, then recognition, then a desperate attempt to reassemble his mask of charming authority. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus said, his voice suddenly smooth, though he did not release Alara's arm. "Enjoying your party?" Julian Thorne did not rush. He was not performing. He moved with an unhurried grace that was the very definition of power, a deep, structural power that had no need for swagger. His suit was a dark charcoal, impeccably tailored, his presence a zone of absolute calm. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze not on Marcus, but on Alara. He was looking at her, really looking, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a flicker of something that felt dangerously like recognition. "I believe the lady asked you to let her go," Julian said. His voice was low and steady, a quiet hum that vibrated with authority. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, an observation of a protocol that had been breached. The air on the terrace seemed to crystallize. The distant music from the ballroom faded into a dull thrum. Marcus's face flushed a dangerous mottled red. To be challenged, here, now, by this man, it was an unthinkable humiliation. "This is a private matter," Marcus snapped, trying to reassert his dominance. "Between my wife and me." Julian's eyes, a cool, intelligent gray, finally shifted to Marcus. The change was subtle, but the pressure in the air increased tenfold. It felt as if the temperature had dropped. "Your private matter is taking place on my property, involving a guest I find to be in distress. It has, therefore, become my concern." He took another slow step forward. "Take your hand off her." The command was delivered without heat, without anger. It was as calm and final as a judge's gavel. For a heartbeat, Marcus's arrogance warred with a primal instinct for self-preservation. He was a vice president. This man was a king in his own castle. With a final, vicious squeeze, Marcus let her go. He tried to style it as his own choice, a magnanimous concession. But the tremor in his hand betrayed him. He smoothed down his jacket, a nervous, jerky movement. "My wife is just a bit overwhelmed," Marcus said, attempting a conspiratorial smile that didn't reach his eyes. Too much excitement. Julian did not acknowledge the excuse. His attention was back on Alara. He saw the faint red marks on her arm where the emerald silk was crushed. He saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He was not saving a damsel. He was witnessing a rebellion and choosing a side. "Are you all right, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. Before Alara could answer, Marcus stepped in front of her, a clumsy attempt to reclaim his position as her shield and interpreter. "She's fine. We were just about to head back inside." Julian's gaze flickered past Marcus's shoulder to two men in dark suits who had appeared silently at the terrace doors. They were part of the venue's security, which meant they were his men. They stood at ease, but their stillness was watchful. His stillness magnified. "I don't believe she will be joining you," Julian stated again as a simple fact. He looked at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. It was her move. He had cleared the board for her. Alara took a single step to the side, moving out from behind the eclipse of her husband. It was a small movement, but it felt momentous. She met Julian Thorne's gaze. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will not." Marcus stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The code had been broken. The program had failed to run. He turned back to Julian, his face contorting with a new, dawning horror. This was not a social misstep. It was a corporate assassination. "Now, see here, Thorne," he began, his voice rising in panic. Julian raised a single calm hand. He did not look at Marcus. He spoke to one of the security men. "Mr. Vance is leaving. Please show him the way out." The two men moved with a fluid, silent efficiency. They did not touch Marcus, but they flanked him, their presence an undeniable wall. Marcus sputtered, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You can't do this. I am a guest. I am your primary partner on the merger." "The status of the merger is currently under review," Julian said, his voice still impossibly calm. "As is your status as a guest. Good night, Marcus." The finality in his tone broke something in Marcus. His bluster collapsed, leaving behind a raw, impotent rage. He shot a look at Alara, a look that promised retribution. Then, hemmed in by the two silent figures, he was escorted off the terrace and through a side door, disappearing from the gala like a ghost. The terrace was suddenly, profoundly quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. Alara stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The adrenaline of the confrontation was beginning to recede, leaving a shaky vulnerability in its wake. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-preservation. Julian Thorne remained where he was, giving her space. He was not crowding her. He was not rushing to comfort her. He was waiting, allowing her to find her own footing. After a long moment, he gestured to the glass he had left on the balustrade. "That was my water," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I can have someone bring you something stronger if you like. Or tea. My mother insists that tea is the answer to most of life's unpleasantries." The mention of his mother was so unexpected, so disarmingly normal that it broke through her shock. A small, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Tea sounds ambitious right now." "Water, then," he said. He retrieved his own glass and then gestured for her to walk with him, not toward the ballroom, but to a small private elevator she hadn't noticed, concealed behind a panel of ivy. His assistant, a woman with a severe haircut and an expression of serene competence, was waiting there. She met Julian's eyes, gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and pressed a button. She was already on her phone, her thumb flying across the screen. The problem was already being managed, contained, and archived. The elevator ride was silent. It was not an awkward silence. It was a recuperative one. Alara watched the lights of the floors flicker past, feeling as though she were ascending from some deep, dark ocean. When the doors opened, it was not into another corporate space, but a private library, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, rich leather armchairs, and the scent of old paper and lemon oil. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth. "Please," Julian said, gesturing to one of the armchairs. His assistant had already vanished, presumably to procure the promised water and handle the cascading fallout of ejecting a key merger partner from a gala. Ilara sank into the chair, the soft leather sighing around her. She felt the exhaustion of the past few years settle into her bones. It was a deep, cellular weariness. She looked at the man standing by the fire, his profile outlined in the warm light. He was an enigma of quiet power. "Why?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why did you do that?" Julian turned from the fire to look at her. His gray eyes were serious, analytical. He was not a man given to impulse. His actions were always the result of careful calculation. "A few reasons," he began, his voice steady as iron wrapped in silk. "First, as I said, you were in distress on my property. My firm has certain standards regarding the conduct of its guests and partners. He was in violation of them." He paused, letting the corporate justification hang in the air. It was a shield, both for him and for her. A way to frame the event that stripped it of its messy, personal nature. "Second," he continued, moving to a heavy mahogany desk, "I am an admirer of your work." Ilara's head snapped up. "My work?" He picked up a slim portfolio from the desk and held it out to her. It was bound in simple black leather. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. She opened it. Inside were pristine copies of her initial concept sketches for the Meridian Tower, designs she had drawn in her private notebook, which she thought Marcus had thrown away. There were architectural renderings of the Azure building, with handwritten notes in the margins in her own script. Things she had never submitted, things Marcus had told her were too academic or not commercially viable, before incorporating their core principles into his own final proposals. Where did you get these?" she breathed, tracing the line of a sketch with her fingertip. It felt like seeing a ghost of herself, a version of her that had been full of hope and creative fire. "My due diligence on Sterling Cole was extensive," he explained without a hint of apology. "We look for assets, but we also look for liabilities, and we look for talent that is being misallocated. Our source within their R&D department was quite thorough. These were recovered from a discarded server drive." He was telling her that he knew. He knew she was the mind behind the success. He knew Marcus was a fraud. The validation was so potent, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical blow. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and sharp. She had been invisible for so long, her contributions erased, her voice silenced. To be seen so clearly and completely by a man like this, it was disorienting. "He told me they were lost," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "He was mistaken," Julian said simply. He took a seat in the chair opposite her, creating a space of quiet consultation between them. "Mrs. Vance, Ilara, what Marcus did tonight was not just a social infraction. It was the act of a man who is losing control and is willing to use force to maintain it. That is a pattern that escalates. You are not safe with him." She knew he was right. The certainty of it was a cold weight in her stomach. "I know. I was leaving. Tonight was the last time." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a data point he had already suspected. "Good. But your plan, whatever it was, is now compromised. He is humiliated and angry. He will not be rational. You require a more robust exit strategy." His assistant reappeared as silently as she had left, placing a tall glass of ice water on a small table beside Ilara. She then handed Julian a tablet. He glanced at it briefly. "My legal team has been put on retainer for you," he said, his eyes still on the tablet. "They specialize in complex domestic separations, particularly those involving high-net-worth individuals and intellectual property disputes. They will file on your behalf in the morning." Ilara stared at him, speechless. It was all happening so fast, a tidal wave of decisive action that was sweeping her along. "A car is waiting downstairs," he continued, setting the tablet aside. "It will take you to a private residence. It is secure. You will be comfortable there while we handle the transition." He finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "You will not be going back to your home. You will not be seeing Marcus again unless it is in a courtroom. These are not suggestions. It was an offer of absolute protection delivered as a series of commands. Part of her, the part that had been fighting for autonomy, bristled at the high-handedness of it, but a larger, more exhausted part of her felt an unspooling of tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. It was the disorienting relief of a soldier being told the war was over, that she could finally lay down her arms. She started, but her voice failed her. What could she say? Thank you? I'm not your problem? I can handle myself? None of it felt right. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said, seeming to read her turmoil, except to be safe. Let us start there. The rest can be negotiated. The word negotiated was a key. It implied she had a say, that this was a partnership, not a rescue. It was a lifeline to her own agency. She took a deep breath, the first one that felt like it reached the bottom of her lungs. All right, she said. Safety. Let's start there. The residence was not a house, but an entire floor of a sleek, modern tower overlooking the park. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling living space, furnished with an understated, masculine elegance that was clearly Julian's own taste. It was minimalist, but not cold, filled with interesting art and comfortable-looking furniture. It was a space designed for quiet contemplation. A woman with kind eyes and silver hair braided into an elegant crown was waiting for them. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and trousers, and her smile was genuine. You must be Alara, she said, her voice warm and melodic. She stepped forward and took Alara's hands in her own. Her skin was soft. I am Eleanor Thorne, Julian's mother. I am so glad you are here. Ilara was taken aback. This was his mother. He had brought her here to his mother's home. Julian told me you might be coming, Eleanor continued, her gaze full of a startlingly direct empathy. He also told me you're the brilliant mind who designed the atrium concept for the new museum wing. I saw the early drafts, truly inspired. She patted Alara's hand. We have a guest suite prepared. You must be exhausted. We can talk in the morning. Or not. You can have all the quiet you need. Julian stood back, allowing his mother to take over. He watched Alara's face, the guarded tension slowly giving way to a dazed sort of peace. His mother had that effect on people. She was the heart of his highly structured world, the one person whose power was not based on wealth or influence, but on an unshakable foundation of grace. Over the next few days, Alara existed in a strange, quiet bubble. The world she had known was gone, but the new one had not yet fully formed. She slept in a room with a wall of glass that looked out over the trees, waking to the gentle light of morning instead of the familiar dread. She ate meals with Eleanor, quiet affairs where they talked about art, about gardens, about everything except Marcus. Eleanor never pried. She simply created a space of sanctuary, a place where Alara could breathe. Julian was a quiet presence. He would leave for work early in the morning and return late at night. Sometimes she would find him in the library, reading, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. They began to have conversations in those late hours, stilted at first, then flowing more easily. She found herself telling him about her designs, her theories on the use of light and space, the frustration of having her ideas filtered through Marcus's commercially minded mediocrity. He listened. He did not just hear the words, he understood the concepts behind them. He would ask sharp, insightful questions that showed he was not just being polite. He was engaged, he was interested. For the first time in years, she felt like a peer. The problem with Marcus's version of the Meridian Tower, she explained one night, sketching on a napkin, is that he saw the central support as a structural necessity to be hidden. I saw it as a spine, something to be celebrated, an internal sculpture that the rest of the building grows around. Julian studied the small, hurried sketch. A spine, he repeated softly, the source of its strength made visible. He looked up at her, and the recognition in his eyes was so intense it made her breath catch. It would have been magnificent. During the day, she met with the lawyers. They were a team of sharp, impeccably dressed men and women who treated her not as a hysterical wife, but as a client with a significant intellectual property claim. They laid out the evidence Julian's team had gathered: server logs, early drafts, witness statements from former colleagues. The case was, they explained, overwhelmingly in her favor. Meanwhile, Julian was moving. She only saw glimpses of it. A quiet phone call his assistant, Sarah, would take in the corner of the room. A headline on a financial news network about unexpected turbulence at Sterling Coal. A sudden, unexplained drop in their stock price. He was not launching a frontal assault. He was dismantling Marcus's world from the foundations up, quietly, methodically, and absolutely. He was buying up corporate debt, leveraging old contracts, and having quiet conversations with board members who were suddenly very eager to listen to Thorn Industries. He was a force of nature, but a quiet one, like tectonic pressure building deep beneath the earth. Marcus, for his part, was operating under a fatal delusion. He was blind with arrogance. His first move was to file for divorce himself, his petition a work of fiction painting Ilara as mentally unstable and adulterous, claiming she had been seduced by Julian Thorne's power. He tried to freeze their joint assets. He sent her a barrage of texts and emails, alternating between threats and pleas. "You have 3 days, Ilara," one text read. 3 days to come to your senses and come home before I ruin you. Another, hours later, "I miss you. This is all a misunderstanding. Let's just talk." He fundamentally misunderstood the situation. He thought he was in a domestic dispute. He had no idea he was in a war with a superpower who had already won. He was a man shouting at a hurricane. His escalation came a week later. Sterling Coal's board, panicking at the sudden financial instability and the silent withdrawal of Thorn Industries' merger offer, called an emergency meeting. Marcus, convinced this was his chance to reassert control, prepared a presentation to rally them. He believed he could spin the situation, blame Thorne's hostility on the personal dispute, and emerge a hero. He also made one last desperate attempt to force Ilara's hand. He had her served with a subpoena at Eleanor's address, a brutish public attempt to drag her into his mess. The papers were handed over by a smirking process server, but the man was met at the door by Julian's head of security, a large, placid man named Arthur, who took the papers, thanked him, and closed the door. The confrontation Marcus had hoped for never materialized. That evening, Julian found Ilara in the library, staring at the subpoena on the table as if it were a venomous snake. "My lawyers have already filed a motion to quash," he said, his voice calm. "It's meaningless, a scare tactic." "It's not meaningless," she said, her voice tight. "It's a violation. He's trying to pull me back into the mud with him." She looked up at him, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. "I'm tired of being a victim in this story, Julian. I'm tired of hiding while you fight my battles." He considered her for a long moment. "What do you propose?" "I want to be at that board meeting tomorrow," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He built his career on my work. I want to be there when it comes down." He did not argue. He did not try to protect her from it. He simply nodded. "All right. Sarah will make the arrangements. You will be credentialed as a consultant for my team." He paused. "You should wear the emerald dress." The Sterling Coal boardroom was a theater of anxiety. The long, polished table reflected the strained faces of the board members. Marcus stood at the head of the table, a projector screen behind him displaying a graph of projected growth that everyone in the room knew was pure fantasy. He was sweating, though the room was cool. His confidence was a cheap suit he had worn for too long, the seams beginning to split. "As you can see," he was saying, his voice a little too loud, "this recent downturn is a temporary anomaly, a market reaction to a hostile and deeply personal action by Thorn Industries." The doors to the boardroom opened. Everyone turned. Julian Thorne walked in. He was not alone. Behind him was his assistant, Sarah, and 2 of his lawyers. And beside him, walking with a calm, deliberate grace, was Ilara. A collective gasp went through the room. Marcus froze, his mouth open. He stared at Ilara as if he were seeing an apparition. She was wearing the emerald gown, but today it was not armor. It was a banner. Her expression was serene, her gaze unwavering. "Thorne," the chairman of the board sputtered, rising to his feet. "This is a private meeting." "Not anymore." Julian said quietly. He and his entourage took seats at the far end of the table, which had been left conspicuously empty. They moved with a shared, unnerving calm. I believe I have a vested interest in this discussion. As of an hour ago, Thorne Industries completed its acquisition of a majority stake in this company's primary debt holder, which means, for all intents and purposes, I am your new bank. Please, continue, Marcus. You were at hostile action. The color drained from Marcus's face. He looked from Julian to the terrified faces of the board members, and then his eyes landed on Ilara. The fear in his eyes curdled back into pure, desperate rage. She was the cause of this. She was the root of his humiliation. "What is she doing here?" he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at her. "She has no right. This is my career you're destroying." "On the contrary," Ilara said, her voice ringing out in the silent room, clear as a bell. "I'm here to reclaim it." That broke him. The last vestiges of his control shattered. He lunged down the length of the table, his face a mask of fury. "You owe me!" "Everything you are because of me." He reached her side of the table, his hands grasping for her. "You are my wife." Julian did not move. He did not even flinch. He simply watched. Marcus turned to his own 2 security guards who had been standing, forgotten, by the door. They were Sterling Cole employees, men who had been on his personal detail for years. "Take her away!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Get her out of here! Now!" It was the final, fatal miscalculation. The 2 guards looked at Marcus, their expressions blank. They looked at Julian Thorne, who gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Then they looked back at Marcus, and they did not move. In a gesture that was more eloquent than any words, one of the guards took a half-step to his left, subtly positioning himself between Marcus and Ilara. They had refused the order. Their allegiance had shifted. They stood with her. The entire room witnessed it. The absolute public rejection of his authority by his own men. The foundation of his world turned to dust in a single silent moment. Marcus stared at them, his chest heaving. He looked at Ilara's calm, pitying face. He looked at Julian's cold, unmoving one. A sound escaped his throat, a choked animal sob of utter defeat. The fight went out of him, all at once. His shoulders slumped. He dropped to his knees on the expensive carpet, the sound a dull thud in the cavernous silence. He buried his face in his hands and began to weep, not with sorrow, but with the agony of a king whose crown had just been melted down before his eyes. Julian finally spoke, his voice cutting through the pathetic sound. "Arthur," he said to his own man. Arthur stepped forward, helped the sobbing, broken man to his feet, and quietly escorted him from the room. The show was over. In the ringing silence that followed, Julian rose. He addressed the stunned board members, his voice returning to the neutral tone of business. "As I was saying, Thorne Industries is assuming control of Sterling Cole's debt. There will be a restructuring. My team will be in touch." He then turned, his eyes finding Ilara. The coldness was gone, replaced by a quiet respect. He walked to her side and placed a hand lightly on her back. It was not a gesture of ownership. It was one of support, of partnership. He looked at the remaining members of the board, who were staring at Ilara with a new, dawning comprehension. "Allow me to introduce you all properly," Julian said, his voice resonating with pride. "This is Ilara Vance. She is the brilliant architect behind the Meridian Tower, the Azure Building, and the Sterling Cole portfolio that you all thought was the work of that man who just left. And she will be heading the new Architectural Innovation Division of my company, a division we are building specifically for her." The vindication was absolute. It was not just a victory, it was a restoration. The truth, suppressed for so long, was finally brought into the light, in the very room where her work had been stolen and repackaged. Ilara looked at the faces of the board members, seeing the shock and dawning respect in their eyes. She had not been saved. She had been seen. Later that evening, they stood on the terrace of Julian's penthouse. Not the gala terrace where her old life had ended, but a different one, higher up, with a clearer view of the city lights. The air was cool and clean. Ilara was no longer wearing the emerald gown. She was in a simple silk blouse and trousers, comfortable in her own skin. She held a glass of water, the ice clinking softly. The sound was no longer a prelude to chaos, but a small, peaceful note in the quiet of the night. She finally felt it, the slow, deep exhale she had been holding in for a decade. The weight on her chest, the one she had carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there, was gone. A real smile touched her lips, one that reached her eyes. Julian stood beside her, not touching, but his presence was a warm, solid certainty. He was watching the city, but she knew his attention was on her. "Is it strange?" he asked quietly. "To have it all change so quickly?" "It wasn't quick," she replied, her voice soft. "It was slow, years of slow. The ending was just efficient." She turned to look at him, at the man who had seen the blueprint of her soul when everyone else was just looking at the facade. "Thank you, Julian. Not for saving me, but for seeing me." He met her gaze, his gray eyes holding a warmth she had never seen before. "Competence should be recognized," he said, as if it were the most obvious law of physics, "and talent should be given the space to build." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers laced with hers, a gesture that felt less like the start of a passionate romance and more like the signing of a treaty between two sovereign nations. It was a connection based on mutual respect, on a shared understanding of how things ought to be. It was solid. It was real. "I have a proposal for you," he said, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. She raised an eyebrow. "Another one?" A faint smile touched his lips, a rare and precious thing. "A personal one. My mother has grown quite fond of you. She is already annoyed at the thought of you moving out. She says you're the only one who understands her affinity for brutalist architecture." Ilara laughed, a genuine happy sound that seemed to surprise them both. "She has excellent taste." "She does," he agreed. "She also thinks we make a good team." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "I am inclined to agree with her. I don't leave because things become complicated, Ilara. I stay." It was the quietest, most profound declaration she had ever heard. It wasn't a promise of a fairy tale. It was a statement of intent, a promise of steadfastness. He was not offering her a happily ever after. He was offering her a what comes next, together. She thought about the silence she had once built as a fortress. Now, standing here beside him, she felt a new kind of silence. Not an absence of noise, but a shared space of peace. The kind of quiet that doesn't need to be defended, the kind you can build a life in. She squeezed his hand. "I think," she said, looking out at the glittering city, a vast canvas waiting for new designs. "I'm inclined to agree with her, too." The future was not a straight line, but a complex, beautiful structure they would design together. And for the first time in a very long time, Ilara Vance felt like she was finally home.